Howdy there, listener. Welcome to Real, Audio Essays and Mysteries. You can call me Carter, and I'll be your host. Come with me as we wade through news stories, mysteries, declassified government files, true crimes, cults, and legends. Everyone and everything has a story, and there are so many out there. Some fact, some fiction, but all in need of being processed, analyzed, categorized, and above all, told. So, if you would, please pull up a chair, join me by the fire, and lend me your ear, because I have so much that I want to tell you. Something a bit different. What exactly do Hispanic and Latino mean? So, even though it's early in this show's lifespan, I found it fitting to offer something a bit different from the usual stories that one might find here. Something not so dour, frightening, or depressing. You know, I wouldn't exactly call this topic lighthearted, but it isn't particularly dark or mysterious, at least in the conventional sense. I mean, there's going to be some things that pop up, but not like any of the stuff we're doing on our Tornado series or anything we've done on any of the FBI files or the other stuff that I'm writing. This is going to be pretty light. It's just something that I couldn't get out of my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I decided to, research, deep dive, and write a script because I find it interesting. Maybe you will too. I've already said the title, and you might have already read it, so let's get into it. What exactly do Hispanic and Latino mean? Now, I'm sure you've heard the terms, especially if you live somewhere like in my great state of Texas, and you've probably heard them used interchangeably to describe the same people, or even the same person. I'm also betting that you have a bit of confusion around that particular subject. I know I had some, for quite some time, because it's also just kind of hard to not be a little bit confused when it seems like the people using the terms and claiming them seem to be unsure of them themselves. Now, I'm not Hispanic, nor am I Latino, though, well, technically, but we'll get into that later. And this isn't an attempt by some random white guy on the internet to mansplain terms to the people that use them or tell them that they can't use them. Words change and evolve over time. A people can use whatever terms they feel best identify themselves, their culture, and their common struggles. Identities and labels are used as a way of bonding and fostering community. And that's their choice. However, it should be noted that these words weren't ones that they chose. They weren't chosen by these groups, but rather they were given to them by outsiders. It should also be noted that while a community can name themselves however they wish, there are those that choose to wield these words in such a way, or in such ways as to gatekeep others they don't see fit from their communities, or for their communities, usually based on race, ethnicity, class, gender nonconformity, and sexuality. This is and has always been wrong, so just wanted to get that out. Now, what I'm going to be talking about in this particular case here is the historical and political uses for these terms, where they come from, and what they mean in that particular context. So with that out of the way, let's begin. At first glance, the division seems pretty simple, but many get tripped up on it. Usually on the need for a division at all. Despite us always dividing ourselves, whenever it comes up, we get confused. It's almost like we just can't agree on anything. But it's also the fact that these terms have a division within themselves. Calling someone one thing or the other, or both, seems strange, mainly due to how these words are viewed. People view them, like in America, like they do race. Usually just have a white person or a black person. There's nuances and shades in between, as well as biracial people and multiracial and all that, but you usually don't see someone combining or compounding a bunch of terms before moving on to the other aspects of their identity. Someone claims to be bi or multiracial and may expand on what that means if asked, but they usually don't just list everything out at the beginning and what they claim and who they are right off the bat, and it's similar with ethnicity. So what gives here? Well, I'd like to note up front that what I just said is an incredibly compressed and sky-high overview of what's actually a very nuanced and complicated topic, and I'm aware of that. But getting into that would take just hours all by itself. That, and we're going to get a little bit into it more as we go on. So let's start with Hispanic, as it's the simplest to explain. Now, you've heard it interchangeably with Latino, Latina, Latinx, and even Latin, and that is used primarily when referring to Mexicans here in the United States, or people with Mexican ancestry, since they're, our neighbor and our largest group of Latinos and Hispanics in the country. And this is probably why there's so much confusion. We view everything through an American and particularly Mexican lens, or with a Mexican lens. We kind of just put it on everybody. We like to view everyone who's brown and speaks Spanish as being Mexican. And that's not a good thing, and does have racist ties and undertones, but sometimes it's just people wanting simplicity, not even thinking beyond it. It's not always evil, though it does come from white supremacy, unfortunately. Trying to make everything down to one simple thing and othering other people, while at the same time taking away their diversity, their agency, their nuance, and everything that makes them great, either on an individual level or as a group. We just kind of like to slap whatever labels that we see fit because we get to make the labels and yada yada yada. We all know how that goes. But despite being having a bad beginning, not everyone uses it that way with malice. It's still wrong and frankly ignorant and stupid, but they're just not thinking. They're thinking, usually, if the person is brown and speaking Spanish, there's a really, really high chance that they're Mexican, since that's who we're used to. That's who we're connected to. That's where most of our immigrants are from, especially here in Texas. I mean, we used to be part of it, so it just kind of makes sense. But we know that's not the case. There's lots and lots of countries besides Mexico that speak Spanish and also have brown people. And this gives us insight into what Hispanic means. Now, you'd be wrong for calling a Spanish speaker who wasn't from Mexico Mexican, but you wouldn't be for calling them Hispanic, since Hispanic specifically relates to a people, place, country, etc. that speaks Spanish as their main language. That's pretty much the only criteria. A country that was colonized or influenced by Spain and speaks Spanish as a result. And technically speaking, they don't even have to be colonized by them. You see, Mexico was colonized by Spain, as well as much of Latin America. They speak Spanish, so they're Hispanic. America and Canada, on the other hand, or rather the United States of America and Canada, speak predominantly English, were originally colonized by the English. So we're not Hispanic. We're Anglo-Saxons or whatever. We're English. It's pretty cut and dry. They speak Spanish over there, so they're Hispanic. They don't over here, so they're not. Unfortunately, that's where the simple stuff ends. Now, as you may have already realized when I mentioned Latin America earlier, not every country in Latin America speaks Spanish. In fact, the biggest one, Brazil, speaks Portuguese. Now, you would be correct in that fact, and that's why Brazil and other countries like it aren't Hispanic. They are, however, Latino, because they're in Latin America, and this is where things get kind of complicated. Because Latino means someone who comes from or has ancestry from Latin America. And that's weird in of itself because when we hear Latino, we think Latin. We call them Latin people, which also technically is incorrect and correct at the same time. But Latino is specifically talking about people from Latin America, not just Latin in general. See, Hispanic refers to someone from or has ancestry from a Spanish-speaking country, and that includes Spain, who are Hispanics. It's where we get Hispanics from. They invented it. This, by the way, also tends to trip people up because of the close association with race, like I said earlier. People assume Hispanic equals brown, which is wrong in so many different ways. But when they equate it to that, they see the actual Spanish, the Spaniards, and get really, really, really confused because they look like they invented white people. I mean, many of them are nearly see-through. But jokes aside, Spain is a very white Western European country, just like many of the others it's attached to. It's 81% white, but they're still all Hispanic. It's where the Spanish language comes from, of course. Now, to make things easier from here on out, and probably in life in general, throw away pretty much all your assumptions about race. Like actual assumptions, things that you might believe. They're just totally untrue, we know they're untrue, yada yada yada. May not throw it all away, not necessarily to use or to profile, because that's evil, but just in a way of understanding the world. Because just because something's not real doesn't mean the world doesn't, use it or reinforce it. So be aware of it, but you kind of want to throw it all out the window, because we view it, even with our own stupid rules that we made up, we don't follow them and got confused, and it all doesn't make sense. So yeah, just throw it all out the window. Just get rid of it all. Because Hispanic and Latino aren't racist. They have nothing to do with skin color. Even ethnically, they aren't what I would call complete or accurate terms. They're just one of many descriptors in line what someone would ascribe to a person or culture, land. You get the idea. While the Hispanics and Latinos we're used to seeing in America are usually brown or darker skin, that has nothing to do with being Hispanic or Latino. It has everything to do with the land that they come from, and the fact that that land was originally inhabited by natives who had darker skin, much darker skin, because it's hot down here. The sun's hot and it's bright, so you have to adapt to it, just like those people in Africa adapted to it, and they got even darker skin. Some places, really, really dark skin, because the sun is trying to kill them. That's what happens. And then up north, where the sun barely comes out, you got people who are basically see-through, trying to get as much vitamin D as they can. That's just how it works. Now, of course, this is over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years and whatnot, but it's literally all because of the sun, even down to why our eyes are shaped differently. Besides of just the genetics of your family, of a people as a whole, why would some people have eyes that are round and more open versus some people that would have something that's squinted or slanted, something that would you think would be kind of harder to see through? It's because if you live in a place where the sun is bouncing off of the ground into your face, you need some protection, and eventually life builds it in. It finds a way. So particularly people of the First Nations up in Alaska and in northern Canada and all that, and Arctic, you got a lot of snow. It's cold. So they have a different type of skin tone. They're still protecting themselves from the sun in two different ways, because the sun is bouncing off of all that white and right back onto them, so they're getting hit from above and from below. And their skin can't be completely white or they will burn to death, but they don't need it to be so dark so they can get all of those nutrients and vitamins and such. So then you get, and they're covering up a lot of their skin as well because it's cold up there. But with that light bouncing up from the ground, you need protection, and a lot of them invented protection. Usually cut slits in seal skin so they could see, but after a while, your eyes start to naturally do that. Similar things in Asia. It's not as direct sunlight as it would be in some places of Africa below the equator. In Asia, the sun, it still gets really, really hot and humid down there. The sun's hitting at a different angle because the planet's round. It hits in different angles depending on where you are. So yes, depending on how hot the sun is, how direct it is hitting you, it's going to change your skin color and even your eye shape and pretty much everything about how your body is going to look after a certain time. But that has nothing to do with Hispanic or Latino. The sun doesn't control that. I kind of wish it did, because it'd make this simpler. But as humans, we like to overcomplicate things. And while we're on the topic, Mexican isn't a race either. It's a nationality. Now that seems really, really simple, like grade school simple when it's pointed out, but many people still struggle with it for some reason. And I'll admit that I did as well, because of what I was taught. Even though it's a country, just like the United States. Now, we understand the United States is made up of all different races, ethnicities, etc., but for whatever reason, we don't grant the same ability to other countries. White people exist in Mexico. They make up 20% of the population, according to some estimates. Though those estimates can be a little bit weird because of how they view race and ethnicity, and it being vastly different to how it is in America. But about 20% are like pure white. I mean, have you ever seen the boxer Canelo Alvarez? One of the greatest boxers ever. Fair-skinned, red hair, blue eyes. That man is Irish. But no, he's from Mexico. Born and raised, and so is his family. Guillermo del Toro is another famous Mexican who many would think was an American if it wasn't for his name. born and raised in Mexico as well. In fact, it's the same place as Canelo was, actually, in Jalisco. It's just a fun fact. There's also black Mexicans, because of course there are. It's a country, just like any other. People from all walks of life can live there, and they do. Just like there are black Canadians, black English people. Only thing I think is weird about black English people or black French people is why. Not that it's not possible, just, there's better places. I mean, with America, there's like a whole ocean in between, but it's like you chose to live in France? But again, kidding aside, it's a country. People can move there, especially en masse, put down roots, and the people are there. That's how it works. I'm German-Irish. I'm not currently in Germany or Ireland. I'm in Texas. My family has been for, literally hundreds of years at this point in time. Wow, that's crazy. Well, some of them hundreds, because they were before Texas was a country. And the other one didn't show up until the Civil War. So almost hundreds, but it's been well over 100 years. But yeah, we know that. So there's black Mexicans, as well as all different kinds of color Mexican and different ethnicities and so on and so forth, because it's like a country. Because it is a country. Mexico even had a black president. Their first was Vicente Guerrero. I should be able to pronounce that name a little bit better, but forgive me. Guerrero, elected all the way back in 1829. It's 179 years before the U.S. elected Obama. That's kind of sad, actually. He was also Mexico's second president after the revolution from Spain, while Obama was our 44th. But that's neither here nor there. The point being is that Mexico is much, much more diverse than we give it credit, let alone Latin America as a whole. And now we get to the complicated part. That wasn't already complicated. So Hispanic means speaking or having come from a Spanish-speaking country. Got it, right? And Latino means hailing from Latin America, right? So Spain is Hispanic but not Latino. Brazil is Latino but not Hispanic. And Mexico is both. Well, I guess that doesn't seem so complicated. But wait! What makes a country part of Latin America? That's going to be fun. Because Latin America is generally understood to consist of countries in the Americas, both North, Central, and South. Also, ones in the Caribbean. So the countries in the Americas that were colonized by the Romantic language-speaking countries, otherwise known as the Latin-speaking countries, and who, for the most part, still speak them today. The Romance languages being derived from Latin, like I said, and that being Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. So while Spain speaks a Romance language, since they weren't colonized, because, they were the colonizers, nor are they in the Americas, they aren't Latino. They are, however, Latin, but that's different from being Latino, and that is a whole weird thing. Because Latino is specifically about being part or from Latin America. Now, the countries are in North, Central, and South America, like I said, as well as the Caribbean, and they have many different languages, including French, which always strikes me as weird, but it's true. However, most of them speak Spanish, at least some form of Spanish. And the countries considered in Latin America, at least according to the list on Britannica's website, are Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, French Guiana, though it's a state of the French Republic and not its own country, Guyana, Paraguay, Peru, Suriname, Uruguay, Venezuela, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Puerto Rico is also there, along with some other territories, but they aren't considered country and instead are labeled as dependent entities, because Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. So, they have to be a country, well, country in quotes, because they're not all countries, and in the Americas that was colonized by one of the Latin countries, and then heavily influenced by the culture, and are still speaking one of those languages today. Right? That seems to be the criteria. If that were so, then it, wouldn't be so complicated. I mean, there's a lot of layers to it, but not that complicated. And while most do speak one of the Romantic languages, not all do. So that kind of throws a wrench into that whole thing. Also, while all were colonized, not all broke away from their colonizers. Like I stated before, French Guiana is still part of the French Republic. And I don't mean a French territory. I mean, that's France. They're French in the same way that Hawaii and Alaska are American. However, France itself isn't considered Latino or Latin American. But the little part of it that it owns in South America is. You know, that may make sense to you. And to be honest, it kind of does to me, right? So just because France owns the land doesn't mean that French Guiana isn't Latino or in Latin America. Doesn't mean that it got moved to a different place or is different than the other French colonies or other colonies in general that gained their independence but were still influenced by the culture and speaking the language and yada yada yada, and they're all still considered Latin America. They're just not their own country like the others, but they still tick all those other boxes. I mean, that does make sense. You can split things up, that's fine. And that logic, like I said, is sound to me. However, where it breaks down is that logic isn't applied evenly to everyone else. Because if it was, then the United States would be considered part of Latin America. And being an American would make one Latino, at least in certain areas. Now how, you might be asking? America doesn't check off any of the boxes required to be in Latin America. Sure it does. But we were colonized by the British, you might say, not Spain or any of the others. And you would be correct. However, that's only for the original 13 colonies. The other 37 states were owned by someone else, 35 of which were by Spain and France. And then, well, of course, also Mexico. You know, westward expansion wouldn't really have been possible without the land bought in the Louisiana Purchase, which the U.S. got from France in 1803. Everything west of that was gotten after the Texas Revolution from Mexico, the annexation of Texas in 1845, the Mexican-American War, and then the Mexican Cession in 1848. So, over half the country was previously French and Mexican. Pretty much everything west of the Mississippi. Actually, it was colonized by Spain, France, and Mexico, and they made up the first 3 flags of the 6 flags that flew over Texas. And yes, that's where the theme park Six Flags gets its name. I'm always surprised by how many people don't know that, but neither here nor there. I told you it was a fun episode, with all fun facts. Now, we should be pretty familiar with this. All the different cultures and the different countries that colonized the United States. I mean, just look in Texas, like I said, 6 flags. It's why the culture in parts of the South and Southwest are so different from the rest of the country. Our culture is different here. We're still Americans, but we're also Texans. Not just because of and New Mexicans and Arizonans and Californians, Louisianans, and so on and so forth. And it's not just because of our size or even our distance from each other. It's because of who we used to be. Everything that makes Texas culture special is because of our diverse history and our closeness to Mexico. Cowboy culture is Mexican. Barbecue is Mexican. Our food is Mexican. Our towns, cities, festivals, etc., all influenced by Spain and Mexico. Then, of course, you have Louisiana, who is super French. I mean, so French they don't even have counties over there. They have parishes. So French that they invented their own version of the language that no one really understands. But jokes aside, just those 2 states are shining examples that no, not everything was colonized by the British. And not just those 2 states, but everything west of the Mississippi. They're intrinsically linked to Spain, Mexico, and France. That should make them Latin America, right? That should make them Latin American and anyone who resides in that area Latino, right? No. Or no, you may shout, because we don't speak a Romantic or Latin language. We're a Germanic people. That's where English comes from. And one of the requirements is to speak a Latin language, right? The languages spoken here are English. I mean, we don't have a really main one, but the main one that people speak is English. The other ones are spoken for sure, but English is the one that most people in this country speak. Therefore, we can't be part of Latin America. And I would say you had an argument. And I would even agree with it. except for one little thing, and that being that not all Latin American countries speak a Romance language as their main language, which kind of breaks the whole Latin thing down. Belize and Guyana speak English as their main language. And Suriname, if I'm pronouncing that right, speak Dutch, which kind of just comes out of nowhere. And like I said, those are Germanic languages. Far, far from Latin, despite English stealing most of its words from Latin. But they're considered part of Latin America. They're in the official list, though some will argue against it, but officially, they are part of that region. That complicates things a bit more, doesn't it? It seems to break one of the main tenets or rules that we all had for Latin America. You got English countries and Dutch countries and all these others. Gets kind of weird, but still, they were colonized in part, and then someone else took over, and so on and so forth. And since most of these are independent, they then, are no longer owned by those other countries, except for a few. And they're still Latin America. It's just about the influence in the culture. But that would also work for the United States. Well, you can't just split up a country into multiple regions like that, right? I mean, the U.S. did expand and take over places that would be considered Latin America had we left them alone, but we didn't. They're the United States of America now, and they have to be considered what the U.S. is as a whole. You can't have some of the country be Latin American while other parts of it aren't. That wouldn't make sense. And if that were your argument, I would almost agree with you, if we hadn't already established that there are exceptions to this rule already. One being a U.S. territory, Puerto Rico. It's considered part of Latin America, and I believe they have co-languages, both English and Spanish. But they're a territory. They're not technically part of America. We own them, but they're not a state. They're not part of the land. That's the whole thing. So technically they're on their own because they've always been there and they have all this history. So, and whatever, we just kind of own them, but they're not actually part of America, really. They're citizens for sure, but, we can see why that exception would be made because they're just kind of an island that we bought one day. All right, I'll give you that. But what about French Guiana? Meanwhile, not part of the U.S., French Guiana is a full part of France. It's France's outermost boundary, and it's considered part of Latin America, even though France itself, over their back in Big Daddy Europe, isn't. Being from France doesn't make someone Latino, but someone being from French Guiana would be Latino, and both of those people would be considered French. Ugh. So, we got countries that don't speak a Latin language, and then an extension of non-Latino countries that are considered Latino, or extensions of those non-Latino countries, but they themselves are considered Latino, and also a part of Latin America. By their own rules and exceptions that they've made, everything west of the Mississippi in the continental U.S. could be considered part of Latin America. And not just that, but parts of Canada as well, especially Quebec, considering they're heavily influenced by France and speak French. So why then are why then is the United States and Canada excluded? Well, that I don't know. Don't really have an answer for that. Could be because we're writing those rules and we don't like those countries in that region. I don't know. That's probably closer to the truth than I would like to admit, because that's kind of how history is, kind of how we view third world countries from first world countries, despite failing many of the same rules and objectives and everything that we give those other countries. We fail them more so than they do, but they're still considered third world. It's because we like to be the exception. There might be a dirtiness around it, or so on and so forth. I mean, you can look at the news right now and see how we treat people that are considered Latino and Hispanic. We like to other them. But again, I don't have a complete answer. I don't have a hardcore, written down, it's because of this or this treaty or something like that. It's kind of just because we decided it. But that's not really what this episode was about. It was about what they meant. kind of how to use them correctly. So I gave you all this background to make it simpler. You know there's a larger, nuanced, complicated issue behind these. And knowing that can help, because now I can give you a simpler, condensed way to look at this. So if you're ever confused about what they mean, Hispanic and Latino, or when to use them, remember, Hispanic means coming from a Spanish-speaking country, and Latino means coming from a Latin American country. That's pretty much it. That's the simplest way to understand it. Yes, we understand there's nuance and what does Latin American mean, yada, yada, yada. But if they're in a Latin American country, that's Latino. If they speak Spanish, or rather, if they are from a Spanish-speaking country or culture, they're Hispanic. And if they got both, they're Hispanic and Latino. That's the simplest way. And you don't have to really understand the full reason why or even agree with it to understand it, or to understand how it's used. But that understanding, this little understanding, just how to use the words and the terms, that can help you with understanding even greater, more complicated things, especially in this particular issue. At least that's the hope, and that's kind of how it works for me. Now, I know, weird episode, pretty light, kind of got weird, but like I said when I started this show, it wasn't always going to be about the same things. We were going to hit greatest hits, though some of them we haven't got to, and I'm doing my weird little tornado series on it as well. But it's kind of going to be anything I can tell a story about. Anything I can deep dive and research. If you don't like this one, or you want the darker ones, there's going to be ones about serial killers and death cults. That's coming. If you like the tornado stuff, outside of the series that I'm finishing, I just have to finish and writing it, and I'm actually going to record one right after this and upload it the same day as this one. I'm going to have lots of different tornado ones, and weather ones, and other natural disasters. There's going to be all the fun stuff. There's plenty of FBI and CIA files, plenty of conspiracies to do, and maybe even some fictional stories along the way. But again, like I said in the intro episode, I will never say something and tell you it's true if I myself don't believe it's true. And even then, I'll tell you, like, well, here's the reasons why you shouldn't and all that. If I read a creepypasta, I'm not going to pretend that it's real. I'm going to tell you up front, this comes from our creepypasta. Well, you know it. If I read something fictional, if I read a story, I'm going to tell you it up front. But I believe that's all I have for this unusual and kind of free-flowing episode. Despite having kind of a long script, I kind of wanted to play a little bit off the cuff. More conversation. Let me think. Anything else I can say? Any more complications? No. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this strange deep dive into a topic that just wouldn't leave my brain. And I hope you forgive me for my tongue twistiness and my brain sometimes freezing up and going foggy, dealing with a lot of fun issues. But other than that, we'll be back to our regular topics shortly. Possibly on the same day, like I mentioned earlier, with Inconceivable Part 2, A Night of Terror in Lubbock. But until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you back here on Reel to Reel.